The letter fell from his hands like a dying bird. Deputy Kieran Jace had read it 3 times already, standing alone in the jailhouse at midnight, the oil lamp guttering low, and still, the words refused to settle into anything that made sense. His chest was doing something it had not done in years, something that felt dangerously close to breaking open. Outside, the wind howled down the main street of Dustfall, Nevada, rattling the shutters of every boarded window, carrying with it the smell of coming rain and the particular brand of loneliness that only the desert at night could manufacture. Kieran was 31 years old, had survived a war, 2 ambushes, and the slow death of everything he had once loved, and yet a single page of a woman's handwriting was doing what none of those things had managed to do. It was dissolving him. The letter had not been meant for him. That was the thing. It had fallen from between the pages of a Bible that old Reverend Hutchins had brought in as evidence in a property dispute. Some fool legal matter involving the First Methodist Church and the widow Garver's land. And Kieran had opened the Bible only to find the relevant deed, and instead found this. A letter tucked so deep inside the pages of the Book of Ruth that it might have been hidden there on purpose, or dropped by accident, or left by someone who had run out of anywhere else to keep their secrets. Her name was signed at the bottom in handwriting that leaned slightly to the right, as if the letters were reaching toward something just off the edge of the page. Dorothea Ferris. He did not know anyone by that name. He had lived in Dustfall for 4 years, and he did not know a single Dorothea Ferris, and somehow that made the letter more devastating, not less, because every word of it had been written by someone who felt exactly the way he did, like a person standing in a crowd of 1,000 souls and finding no eyes that recognized them. She had written about loneliness the way a surgeon describes a wound, with precision, with a kind of terrible expertise that only comes from long familiarity. She had written, "I do not know if anyone will ever read these words, but I find I must write them anyway, because if I do not, they will press against the inside of my ribs until something gives. I am not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. I tend my garden and I keep my house and I do my work, and I am not unhappy. But I have begun to believe that the heart can be perfectly functional and still be terribly, specifically alone. And I wonder sometimes, late at night, if there is anyone on this earth who is waiting for someone exactly like me without knowing it yet." Kieran set the letter down on the desk. He pressed both palms flat against the wood. He whispered into the empty jailhouse, "I have been waiting for someone like you." The lamp flickered. The wind threw itself against the door. And Deputy Kieran Jace, a man who had been called stone-faced by 3 sheriffs, unreadable by 2 women who had tried to love him, and solitary by every person who had ever attempted to be his friend, felt the locked room at the center of his chest crack open just enough to let a single thread of light inside. He had to find her. He had no idea how that was going to go. 4 years earlier, Kieran had arrived in Dustfall with a horse, a badge that he had not asked for, and a reputation that preceded him the way smoke precedes fire. He had served as a deputy in Abilene before the Trouble, and before Abilene there had been the war, and before the war there had been a family homestead in eastern Kansas that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. He did not talk about the war. He did not talk about Kansas. He talked about the law, because the law was one of the few things that still made sense to him. It had rules, it had consequences, and it did not ask you how you were feeling. Sheriff Aldous Crane had hired him on the spot, shaken his hand, and told him the town needed someone who looked like they meant business. Kieran had taken that as a compliment. though he suspected it was partly an observation about the permanent set of his jaw and the way he never quite smiled all the way. Dustfall was not a large town. It sat at the edge of the Nevada desert, like a man who had sat down to rest and never quite gotten back up. It had a main street with the usual assortment of establishments, a general store run by a man named Briggs who weighed everything on scales that were very slightly crooked in his favor, a saloon called the Dusty Rose that was neither particularly dusty nor resembled a rose in any discernible way, a livery stable, a hotel that doubled as a boarding house for travelers who did not want to sleep on the open ground, a telegraph office, a church, and a schoolhouse. Kieran had learned the town's rhythms the way a man learns to read weather, not by being told, but by watching long enough that the patterns revealed themselves. He knew which nights the miners came in from the ridge camps and what that meant for the Dusty Rose. He knew which families had bad blood with which other families, and where not to stand if that bad blood ever started running hot. He knew that the telegraph operator, a man named Fitch, drank alone every Thursday and that this was not something anyone commented on. He knew the town's secrets the way a doctor knows a patient's body, not because anyone had told him, but because his job required him to notice. What he did not know was Dorothea Ferris. The morning after finding the letter, he asked Briggs at the general store if he knew the name. Briggs scratched his neck and said he didn't think so, but that there had been a woman come in a few weeks back, bought flour and lamp oil and some calico fabric, paid cash, didn't give a name. He described her as being around 30, brown hair, serious face. Said she had come in from the eastern road, the one that led out toward the canyon farms. Kieran thanked him and asked nothing further, because he had learned long ago that asking too many questions in a small town was like dropping a stone in still water. The ripples went everywhere, and you could not control them. He spent the morning doing his actual work, which on that particular Thursday included settling a dispute between two miners over a disputed claim stake, delivering a summons to a rancher named Hollies who had been very deliberately ignoring it for 2 weeks, and fixing the lock on the jailhouse door, which had been sticking since the spring thaw. None of this was glamorous. Most of law work was not. Kieran had made his peace with that a long time ago, but all the while, the letter was in his breast pocket, folded carefully against his heart like a thing he was trying to keep warm. He rode out toward the canyon farms in the late afternoon, telling himself he was doing his regular circuit, which was technically true. He did a circuit of the outlying properties every week or so, checking that nothing had gone wrong, and that he just happened to be going in the direction of the eastern farms today, which was only somewhat true. The canyon farms were a cluster of small homesteads that had grown up along the base of the Red Rock Canyon, about 6 miles east of Dustfall. The soil there was better than anywhere else in the region, because the canyon channeled both water and shade during the brutal summer months, and several families had settled there over the past decade and done reasonably well by the standards of the desert. There were 7 farms in total. Kieran knew the families at 6 of them. The 7th was at the far end of the canyon, set slightly apart from the others, with a garden that was more ambitious than any of the neighboring plots. He had ridden past it before and noticed the garden. Anyone would, because it was the kind of garden that took real effort and real intention in this climate, with vegetables growing in neat rows and herbs in clay pots along the porch railing and a small orchard of maybe a dozen young apple trees that were just beginning to come into their own. Someone had put a great deal of themselves into that piece of land. He reined in his horse, a steady bay gelding named August, at the gate. There was a woman kneeling in the garden, pulling weeds from around a row of bean plants, her back to him. She was wearing a faded blue dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow despite the cooling afternoon air. She had not heard him ride up, or if she had decided not to acknowledge it. He cleared his throat. She turned around. He had not been expecting her face. He could not have said exactly what he had been expecting, but it was not this. A face that looked like someone who had thought about things, really thought about them, in the way that left marks. Not the softened, slightly vacant prettiness that was considered the appropriate thing for a woman's face in this time and place, but something more like intelligence worn on the surface of the skin. Brown eyes that assessed him in about 3 seconds and clearly filed away what they found. A small scar at her left temple that caught the light. Hands that were dirty from the garden and did not seem apologetic about it. She was perhaps 28 or 29, he thought. Close enough to his own age that it felt relevant in a way he could not have explained. "Deputy," she said. Not a greeting exactly, more an acknowledgement of a fact. "Afternoon," he said. "Are you Dorothea Ferris?" Something moved through her expression, surprise, then wariness, then a careful smoothing over of both. "I am," she said. "Have I done something wrong?" "No, madam," he said. Nothing like that. She waited. Kieran had planned loosely what he was going to say. He had thought about it on the ride out, turning over various approaches, discarding the ones that sounded presumptuous or strange. What he had settled on was returning the letter to Reverend Hutchins and mentioning to the Reverend that he had found a personal document in the Bible, and letting the Reverend handle the return of it, thereby removing himself from the situation entirely. He had not apparently been able to commit to that plan. "I found something," he said. "That belongs to you, I think." He reached into his breast pocket and took out the letter still folded and held it out across the gate. She stared at it. Then she looked up at him. The wariness in her face had sharpened into something closer to alarm. "Where did you find that?" "In a Bible that came into the jailhouse as evidence in a property case," he said. "Reverend Hutchins's Bible. It wasn't my business to read it, and I want you to know that I put it down the moment I realized it was a personal document." He was lying. He had read every word of it twice before he put it down, and then he had picked it up again. She crossed the garden and came to the gate and took the letter from his hand. Their fingers did not quite touch. She looked down at the folded paper, then back up at him. "You read it," she said. "It was not an accusation. It was just a statement of the obvious, said quietly by someone who was deciding how to feel about it." "I should not have," he said. "No," she agreed. "You should not have." A long silence opened up between them. August shifted his weight, leather creaking. The canyon light was going gold and amber at the edges, doing what desert light did in the late afternoon, which was make everything look simultaneously more beautiful and more precarious. "I am sorry," Kieran said. She looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she said, "Do you want some water? You rode a long way." He almost said no, which would have been the sensible thing. "Yes," he said instead. "Thank you." She had a well at the side of the house, and she drew a bucket and gave him a ladle, and he drank and gave August a drink from the bucket. And they stood in the amber light beside the well, and she still had not decided to be angry at him, which he was increasingly grateful for. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, "at this farm?" "About 8 months," she said. "I came from Sacramento, long way to come." "Yes," she said. "It was supposed to be longer. I was supposed to keep going to Salt Lake City, but I stopped here and I could not get myself to leave." She looked at the canyon walls, at the way the red rock held the light. "I do not completely understand it myself. What were you going to do in Salt Lake City?" She gave him a look that suggested the answer to that question was somewhere inside the letter, and they both knew it. He had the grace to look away. "I was going to find a situation," she said. "Teaching, perhaps, or housekeeping for a family, something with a clear purpose. She paused. I had been keeping house for my brother and his wife in Sacramento for several years after our parents passed. And then, they no longer needed me. She said this with no particular bitterness, but with the kind of precision that comes from having said a thing to yourself so many times in the dark that all the unnecessary emotion has been worn away from it, leaving just the bare shape of what happened. "And you stopped here," Kieran said. "I stopped here," she confirmed. "And I planted a garden, which is either the most practical thing I have ever done or the most impulsive. I have not decided." He almost smiled. It was close enough to a smile that August noticed it and swiveled an ear. "I think," Kieran said carefully, "that it might be both." She looked at him again with that 3-second assessment. "You read the whole letter," she said. "Yes," he admitted. "And you came out here anyway." "Yes." Why? He could not explain the whispered words in the empty jailhouse. He could not explain the way the letter had found the one unlocked door in his chest and walked straight through it. He was not built for that kind of explanation. He was built for actions, for presence, for doing things. "I wanted to return it to you in person," he said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. She seemed to understand that it was not the whole truth. She folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her dress, and she looked at the garden and she said, "You should come back sometime, Deputy. The tomatoes will be ripe in about 3 weeks." He rode home through the falling dark with something in his chest that he had no name for, and had not felt in so long that it took him the entire ride to recognize it. It was hope. He came back in 3 weeks. He told himself it was the circuit. He told himself a lot of things. But he was at her gate on a Tuesday afternoon in early September, when the heat was just beginning to release its grip on the canyon, and he had a jar of preserves from Mrs. Holly's, who had sent him along with them for no one in particular, and he had decided they should go here. And the tomatoes were indeed ripe, hanging from their vines in heavy red clusters like something out of a painting. Dorothea was on the porch with a book when he arrived, and she looked up with an expression that was not quite surprise, and was not quite welcome, and was something in between that he found more interesting than either of those things would have been. "Deputy Jace," she said. "Miss Ferris. Come to return something else that belongs to me. Brought you preserves," he said. "From Mrs. Holly's, apricot." She looked at the jar, then at him. "Mrs. Holly sends preserves to strangers. She sends them to people she thinks could use a gesture," he said. "I may have described you to her." "You described me to Mrs. Holly's. In very general terms." The corner of her mouth moved. He was beginning to catalog the ways her mouth moved when she was suppressing a reaction, because she did it often, and each variation was slightly different and communicated different things. This particular variation said she was amused against her better judgment. "Come up on the porch, then," she said. "I'll make coffee." The coffee was made in a blue enamel pot on a small cast iron stove in a kitchen that was spare but not empty. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, and a shelf of books above the window that held more volumes than he had seen in some of the town's better parlors, and a braided rug on the floor in colors that had clearly once been brighter and had faded into something gentler and more interesting. The house had the feeling of a place that had been arranged by someone who thought carefully about how to live. They sat on the porch with their coffee, and she told him about the book she was reading, which was a collection of letters by a naturalist who had spent 3 years cataloging plants in the desert Southwest. And Kieran listened the way he almost never listened to anyone, completely, without planning his response while she was still speaking, without watching for threats or inconsistencies or anything except what she was actually saying. She was interesting. He had suspected she would be interesting from the letter, but suspecting and experiencing were different things entirely. She had opinions and she stated them plainly, and she also knew when to stop talking and let a silence exist, which was rarer than most people understood. He stayed 2 hours. When he left, she was standing at the gate and she said, "Next Tuesday then," without preamble, and he said, "Yes," and rode away, and did not try to examine what was happening too closely, because he had the sense that examining it too closely would be like touching a soap bubble. It would simply cease to exist. He came back the next Tuesday, and the one after that. That last topic they reached sideways, like two people approaching something hot from an angle, feeling the warmth before they got close enough to be burned. "You were married," she said one afternoon. It was not quite a question. He was quiet for a moment. The garden was all autumn gold now, the bean plants finished, the tomatoes done, the herbs still holding on in their clay pots. "Yes," he said. "What happened?" "She died," he said. "Fever 4 years after we married, we had a son. He died with her." He had not said those sentences out loud in over 3 years. They sat in the air between them with the weight of things that had been carried for a long time. Dorothea did not say she was sorry, which he appreciated, because he was tired of that particular phrase and the helplessness behind it. She said, "How old was he?" 18 months, Kieran said. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "I lost a child too, before he was born. I was married briefly in Sacramento. He left, my husband, I mean. He decided he did not want the life we had made and he left, and I lost the child 6 weeks later, and I think I lost myself for quite some time after that. And then you kept house for your brother." "And then I kept house for my brother," she confirmed. Which was an act of profound practicality and possibly also cowardice. It was very easy to disappear into being useful to other people. Until they no longer needed you. Until they no longer needed me. The silence that followed this was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people have laid down something heavy at the same time and are both just breathing. "I understand that," Kieran said finally, "disappearing into being useful. Into the job," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. "You are not very good at letting anyone be useful back to you," she said, not an accusation, an observation. He thought about that. "No," he said, "I suppose I am not." "Why not?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. August was tied at the gate, dozing in the October warmth, his lower lip hanging loose in the sleepy, comfortable way of horses in repose. Kieran watched the horse and thought about how to answer honestly. "Because needing things from people means they can be taken away," he said. Dorothea was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I know exactly what that is." He looked at her. She was looking at the canyon walls, at the light on the red rock, and her profile was serious and quiet, and held all the things she had described in the letter. The gardening as an act of hope, the heart that was functional and lonely at the same time, and he felt something shift in him with the slowness and inevitability of geology. He did not say anything else that day about it. But when he left, he held her hand for a moment at the gate, just held it, and neither of them made anything of it, and neither of them needed to. The trouble started in late October. It started with a man named Virgil Crane. No relation to Sheriff Aldous Crane, which Virgil was very careful to make clear whenever anyone asked, who rode into Dustfall on a black horse with silver tack, and a reputation that had arrived approximately a week before he did, traveling by telegram and word of mouth from Reno, where he had done something that was never quite spelled out, but that everyone seemed to understand was bad. Virgil Crane was a speculator. That was his polite word for himself. He bought land, or more accurately, he found land that other people were sitting on without perfect legal title, and he found lawyers who could exploit the imperfections in those titles. And then he made things difficult until the people on the land decided it was easier to take his money and go than to keep fighting. He had done this in Reno. He had done it in Carson City. He had apparently done it in Elko as well, though the Elko situation had gone badly in some way that had prompted his rapid departure and arrival in Dustfall. Kieran heard about him from the telegraph operator Fitch, who heard everything, and from Briggs at the general store, who also heard everything but was more selective about what he shared. What Kieran learned was this: Virgil Crane was interested in the Canyon Farms. Specifically, he was interested in the water rights associated with the canyon, which had been claimed under various homestead arrangements over the past decade, and which, according to a lawyer Crane had brought with him from Reno, were not as settled as the canyon farmers believed. The canyon farmers included 6 families that Kieran had known for years, and one woman named Dorothea Ferris, who had been farming the 7th plot for 8 months, and who had bought her land from a man named Crowell who had left for California and had been in somewhat of a hurry when he went. Kieran knew immediately that she was the most vulnerable. He rode out on a Wednesday, not his usual Tuesday, but he could not wait, and found her in the kitchen making bread, flour on her hands and forearms, and he told her what he had learned about Virgil Crane without dressing it up or softening it. She listened without interrupting, her hands still, her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something serious, going very still and interior, like someone closing a window to hear better. "My deed," she said when he finished. "It is from Crowell. It is recorded at the land office in Carson City." "I know," he said. "That should be enough. But Crane's lawyers have a way of finding gaps, and land office records in this region are not always as complete as they should be." "What are they claiming?" "That Crowell's original claim was improperly filed, which means his deed to you may not be valid." She looked down at her hands. A long breath moved through her. "Can they do that?" "They can try," Kieran said. "Whether they succeed depends on whether the records in Carson City can be verified, and whether the land court sides with a homesteader or a speculator." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I will not leave this farm, Kieran." The way she said it, with no drama, just flat certainty, did something to him. "I know," he said. "I am not suggesting you do. I am telling you so that you know what is coming and can prepare." "What do I need to prepare?" "Write down everything you know about how you bought this land. Every detail. The date, the amount, who witnessed it, whether there were any other parties present. Write it down while it is clear in your mind, and send to Carson City for a certified copy of your deed." She nodded. Then she said, "Is this your job, helping me with this?" "Not officially," he said. She looked at him directly. "Then why are you doing it?" He met her eyes. "Because," he said, and then stopped, because what he wanted to say next was something he was not sure he had the right to say yet, and Dorothea seemed to understand that because she nodded very slightly, as if she had heard the rest of the sentence anyway. "I will write it all down," she said. "Tonight." He helped her write the account that evening, sitting at her kitchen table while the bread baked and the canyon went dark, and the oil lamp made a circle of warmth around them. He asked questions and she answered them, and he wrote what she dictated in his clear, angular hand. And by the end of 2 hours, they had a document that laid out the purchase of the land in enough detail to be useful, and signed by both of them as witnesses to each other's testimony. It was strange, writing their names next to each other on a legal document. Kieran Jace and Dorothea Ferris in the same inch of paper, side by side. He noticed it. He looked at it for a moment before he folded the document and gave it to her. Then he put his pen away. "Hungry?" she said. "Yes," he said. She cut the bread and they ate it with butter and the last of the summer's strawberry preserves, which were her own, not Mrs. Hollis's, and which were better. They talked about nothing important for an hour. About the horse that had gone lame at the picket farm, about a book she was reading on astronomy, about whether the winter was going to come early or late. It was the most domestic evening Kieran Jace had spent in 4 years, and he was aware of that fact with an almost physical acuity, aware of how much he had missed it. The simple, ordinary intimacy of a lamp-lit kitchen and food and someone's voice. When he finally stood to go, she walked him to the door, and at the threshold she said, "Kieran." He turned. She was holding the document in both hands, looking at his name on it. "Thank you," she said, "for coming, for not letting me find out from a lawyer." "No one should find out that kind of thing from a lawyer," he said. She almost laughed. The almost laugh was one of his favorite things she did. "Ride safe," she said. He rode home in the cold dark with his coat buttoned up, and the stars thrown out across the desert sky like something extravagant, and he thought about her hands holding that document, his name beside hers, and he thought that there were some things the human heart wanted so badly, and for so long that when they finally began to appear on the horizon, the terror of losing them before they arrived was almost worse than never having seen them at all. He was going to have to be very careful with this. He was going to have to be very good at his job. Virgil Crane presented his legal challenge to the land office in Dustfall the following Monday morning. Kieran was present, having made a point of being present, and watched Crane's lawyer, a thin man named Aldrich who wore a suit that was too fine for the desert and sweated through it anyway, lay out the argument with the practiced smoothness of someone who had made this particular argument many times before. The claim was this: the original homestead filing for the canyon's 7th plot had been made by a man named Dutton, not Crowell, in 1871. Crowell had allegedly purchased from Dutton in 1876, but the transfer had never been properly recorded at the state land office in Carson City, only at the local land office in Dustfall, where the records had been damaged by a fire in 1878. This meant there was a gap in the paper chain that Crane's people were arguing invalidated any subsequent claim, including Dorothea's. It was, Kieran noted grimly, a clever attack. It exploited real failures in the record system. And it was designed to do exactly what it always did: create enough uncertainty and expense that a single woman with limited resources would decide the fight was not worth the cost. He went to see Dorothea that afternoon. She had already heard. One of the neighboring farmers, a man named Albert Park, whose family had been in the canyon for 7 years, had ridden over to tell her. She was in the garden when Kieran arrived, not weeding or tending but just standing among the bare autumn beds with her arms at her sides, and she had the look of someone who was deciding whether to be frightened or furious, and had landed on furious as the more useful option. Good, he thought. "Dutton," she said when he dismounted. "I never heard of any Dutton." "He was the original claimant," Kieran said. "He left in 1873 or so before you came. The sale to Crowell was apparently done very informally. How do I fight this? We need the original Dutton filing. If it can be shown that the transfer to Crowell was witnessed and valid even if unrecorded at the state level, that changes the argument. And we need to establish that you bought in good faith from Crowell, which the document we wrote should help. Can you get the Dutton filing?" "I am going to ride to Carson City," he said. She stared at him. "That is 3 days, 2.5 if I push." "That is, Kieran, that is not your job." "I am making it my job," he said. He held her gaze. He needed her to understand that this was not charity and not just duty and not pity for a woman on her own. He needed her to understand what it actually was, even if he did not have the words for it yet. She seemed to understand. Something in her face shifted, the iron quality of her jaw softened slightly, not from weakness but from receiving something. "The Parkers will look after my garden," she said. "And the animals." "Yes," he said. "I think Albert Parker would do that. When do you leave?" "Tomorrow at first light." A silence. Then she said, "Come inside. I will make supper and you can tell me what else you need." "I know," he said. "I was embarrassed when I realized you had read it. I know that too." "But I am not embarrassed anymore," she said. She was looking at the stars, which surprises me. He did not say anything. He was trying to keep very still, the way you keep still when something wild comes close enough to touch. "I think," she said, "that I put that letter in the Bible so that someone might find it, deliberately or not. I think I needed someone to know." "I am glad I know," he said. She turned her head to look at him. The lamplight from inside the house was reaching them through the window, touching one side of her face, and the stars were touching the other. "Are you?" she said. "Dorothea," he said, and then he stopped, and then he said, "Yes." "I am more glad than I know how to say." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Then say whatever you can and I will understand the rest." He turned his cup in his hands. He looked at the stars. He said, "I have been alone for a long time, and I had made some arrangement with myself about it. Decided it was simply how I was built, how my life was going to go. And then I found your letter and I came out here and I talked to you, and the arrangement fell apart." She was watching him. He kept going, because he had started, and the thing about starting is that you have to go through it. "I do not say this to create any kind of obligation," he said. "You have built something here, something that is entirely yours, and I would not want to be a disruption to that for anything. But I want you to know that I think about you every day, and that Tuesday is the only day of the week that feels properly placed." The silence that followed was long enough that he began to think he had said the wrong thing, or said the right thing in the wrong way, and he had started to prepare his retreat when she said, "Tuesday is the only day of the week that feels properly placed for me too." He looked at her. She looked at him. Then she reached across the small space between their chairs and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that for a long time in the cold, clear night, not saying anything, not needing to. The ride to Carson City took him 2.5 days, as he had calculated. He pushed August harder than he liked to on the second day and made up the extra hours. Carson City was a proper city by Nevada standards, with a state legislature building and real hotels, and a land office that had considerably better records than Dustfall's fire-damaged archive. He spent a day and a half in the land records office, which was staffed by a precise, deeply unenthusiastic man named Garfield, who nevertheless knew where everything was and retrieved files with a professional competence that Kieran had to admire. Together they tracked the Dutton claim, which had indeed been properly filed in 1871. They found a bill of sale dated June 1873, at which time Dutton had sold to a man named Aaron Pierce, not to Crowell. That was the key. Crane's lawyers were claiming Crowell had bought from Dutton directly. But Crowell had apparently bought from Pierce, which was a different transaction and a different chain, and Pierce's purchase from Dutton was recorded right here in Carson City, with 2 witnesses listed. If Pierce's claim was valid, which the record suggested it was, then Crowell's purchase from Pierce was also potentially valid, even if Crowell's subsequent departure had left the local records incomplete. The chain existed. It was just not the chain Crane's lawyers had claimed. Kieran made copies of everything, had them certified by Garfield, paid the fee, and rode out of Carson City the following morning with the documents in his saddlebag, and a feeling in his chest that was partly professional satisfaction, and partly something far more specific and personal. He stopped at a shop near the telegraph office before he left Carson City and bought something. It was a very small thing. He put it in his shirt pocket, not his breast pocket where the letter had been. That was too freighted with meaning, or possibly exactly enough freighted with meaning, and he could not decide, and he rode home. He arrived in Dustfall on a Friday evening, went straight to Sheriff Crane's office, explained the situation with the brevity that the sheriff appreciated, got the sheriff's agreement to attend the following week's land hearing with the new evidence, went home, slept, and rode out to the canyon on Saturday morning, which was not a Tuesday, but he found he could not wait until Tuesday. Dorothea was in the orchard when he arrived, wrapping the young apple trees in burlap against the coming frost. She turned when she heard August, and the look on her face when she saw him, relief, and something that had been holding itself carefully in check releasing all at once, made the 2.5 days each way through the desert entirely and immediately worthwhile. "You found something," she said. She could read him already, which he found he was not afraid of. "I found something," he confirmed, and showed her the documents. She read them slowly, standing in the orchard among the burlap-wrapped trees, and he watched her face change as she understood what she was looking at, the chain of title resolving itself into clarity, the gap in the records closing. "Pierce," she said, "Pierce. Who sold to Crowell?" There may have been another informal transfer between Crowell and Pierce that was not recorded locally, but the state record shows Pierce's original valid purchase, which means the chain from Dutton forward is complete enough to be challenged. Is that enough? It should be. It changes Crane's argument significantly. He was claiming there was no valid chain. There is a valid chain. It is just not the one he mapped. She lowered the documents and looked at him, and her eyes were bright in a way that he was not sure was entirely about the land documents. "Kieran Jace," she said, "you rode 5 days through the desert for my apple trees." "For your apple trees," he agreed, "and for the tomatoes which I fully intend to have access to again next summer." She laughed. Actually laughed, not the almost laugh, the real one, which he had heard only twice before, and both times it had done something to his heart that he had no clinical vocabulary for. She pressed the documents against her chest, holding them the way people held things that mattered, and she looked at him with an expression that was so open and direct that he felt the last remaining lock on the locked room in his chest simply give way, the tumblers falling in sequence, the door swinging free. He reached into his shirt pocket. He had bought her a small pressed tin brooch in Carson City, a modest thing, a sprig of leaves in silver-painted tin, nothing extravagant, nothing that could be misinterpreted as presumptuous, and he held it out. "I saw it and thought of your garden," he said. She looked at the brooch for a long moment. Then she reached out and took it from his palm very carefully and turned it over. Then she looked up at him. "Kieran," she said, "I need to say something and I want you to let me finish before you say anything." "All right," he said. "I have been afraid of this," she said. "Of you specifically. Not because of anything you have done wrong, the opposite, in fact. I am afraid because everything you do is right, and because I can feel myself building something on that, and the last time I built something on a person, it was taken from me, and I was lost for years after. And I am not sure I could survive being lost like that again." She held the brooch. He waited, as promised. "But I also know," she continued, her voice quieter now, "that the alternative is continuing to be alone in the way I described in that letter, and I have been doing that for long enough that I know what it costs. And I think you are someone who does not leave. I think that is one of the things you are. And I have decided to believe that, and I wanted to tell you, because you told me what you could manage to say, and I told you I would understand the rest. But I think you deserve to hear me say the rest out loud." She looked at him steadily. "I think I am falling in love with you," she said, "and it frightens me, and I am choosing to do it anyway." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and he put his hands on either side of her face, very gently, the way you handle something irreplaceable, and he said, "I am not going anywhere. I need you to know that. Whatever else happens, I am not going anywhere." She covered his hands with hers, and he kissed her, there in the orchard among the burlap-wrapped apple trees, in the cold October morning, and it was the kind of kiss that settled something, not wild or desperate but certain. The way you feel when something you have been searching for finally comes to rest in your hands, and you understand you were always going to find it. You just had to survive long enough to get there. The land hearing took place on a Thursday in November, in the small room at the back of the Dustfall Town Hall that served as a local court. It was not a full trial. It was a preliminary hearing before a circuit land judge named Morse, who came through the region twice a year, and who had, in Kieran's experience, very little patience for speculators and very considerable respect for proper documentation. Virgil Crane was there with Aldrich the lawyer, both of them dressed too well and sweating despite the November chill. The 6 other canyon farmers were present, crowded into the back of the room with a mixture of anxiety and stubborn solidarity that made Kieran think better of them than he already had. Albert Parker had brought his wife, a compact, fierce woman named Helen, who had made it clear to anyone who asked that she intended to keep an eye on the proceedings personally. Dorothea sat at the front table beside the lawyer that Kieran had arranged for her through the county seat, a plain-spoken man named Webb who had done land work for 20 years, and who, upon being shown the Carson City documents, had said with quiet satisfaction that Crane's people were going to have a very difficult morning. Webb was right. Aldrich's argument was competent and polished and built entirely on the assumption that there was no valid chain of title beyond Dutton's original claim. The moment Webb introduced the certified copies from Carson City, Dutton to Pierce, properly recorded and witnessed, the argument began to come apart at its foundations. Crane's lawyer pivoted, tried to argue that Pierce's subsequent sale to Crowell was still improperly documented, and Webb countered that the burden of proof for invalidating a good-faith purchase fell on the challenger, not the purchaser, and that Crane's challenge had been predicated on a factual error regarding the original chain that the state records conclusively disproved. Judge Morse asked several pointed questions. Aldrich answered them with decreasing confidence. Crane sat at his table with the expression of a man who was recalculating costs and finding that the column did not add up the way he had expected. At the end of 2 hours, Judge Morse found in Dorothea Ferris's favor. He ordered the local land records corrected to reflect the complete chain of title. He also made a comment, recorded in the court transcript, about the necessity of good-faith buyers being protected from speculative challenges premised on incomplete records, which was as close as a circuit judge in 1882 ever came to calling someone a predator in open court. Virgil Crane left Dustfall the following week. The word from the telegraph office was that he had gone to Utah, which seemed likely to become someone else's problem. Dorothea stood outside the town hall in the November wind after the hearing, holding the court order against her chest, and the look on her face was something Kieran thought he could spend a very long time looking at. Not triumph exactly, but something more durable than triumph. Relief that had earned itself through difficulty. The particular satisfaction of having held on to what was yours. Helen Parker hugged her. Albert Parker shook Kieran's hand with both hands in the way of someone who means it deeply. The other farmers clapped him on the shoulder and said things that he deflected with his usual brevity, and then the crowd dispersed, and it was just the two of them on the main street of Dustfall with the wind coming off the desert. "Coffee," Dorothea said. "Yes," he said. They went to the hotel dining room, which was the only place in Dustfall that served coffee in proper cups, and they sat across from each other at a table by the window and drank their coffee and did not talk much, because there was a particular kind of quiet that came after a thing that had cost something, and both of them understood how to sit in it. After a while, Dorothea said, "What would you have done if the documents had not been in Carson City?" "Fought harder," he said. She looked at him. "How?" "There are other ways to make a speculator's challenge expensive enough that it is not worth pursuing," he said. "Deposing every witness. Requesting every record from every county, making the process itself cost more than any potential gain. You had planned for that." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You planned for every possibility." "That is the job," he said. "No," she said, "it is not just the job." She set down her coffee cup. "Kieran, I would like you to have Sunday dinner with me." He was momentarily caught off balance by the simplicity of the request after everything that had just happened. "Sunday dinner," he repeated. "Every Sunday," she said, "if you are willing." He understood what she was asking. She was asking for regularity, for the particular kind of closeness that is built not in dramatic moments but in the accumulated weight of ordinary ones, shared meals, shared evenings, the slow layering of a life together. "Yes," he said, "I am willing." She smiled. All the way this time, not almost. He thought he would carry that smile in his pocket for the rest of his life. Winter came to Dustfall, and the canyon with its particular desert severity. Not the buried, blanketed cold of Kansas winters that Kieran still sometimes dreamed about, but a sharp, clear cold that made the canyon walls ring and turned the sky the color of old pewter and made the stars at night seem closer than the laws of physics really should have allowed. Every Sunday, Kieran rode out to Dorothea's farm. He began to know her in the ways that only winter can build. The way she moved through her house in the morning, methodical and unhurried, her hair down around her shoulders before she pinned it up. The fact that she preferred her coffee with no sugar, and found people who required a great deal of sugar in their coffee faintly suspicious, which he considered one of her few unreasonable positions. The way she read in the evening with the lamp pulled close, and the book held at a particular angle, like she was in a private conversation with the page. The particular quality of her silence, she had several kinds, and he learned to distinguish them. The satisfied silence of someone content to be where they were, and the thinking silence of someone working something out, and the sad silence that came occasionally and without warning, and that he learned to sit beside without trying to fix, because she did not need fixing, she needed company. He told her things he had not told anyone. Not everything. Some of it had been packed so deep for so long that it would take more time even than this to get to, but enough. He told her about his son, about his wife, about what those losses had done to the way he understood time, which was that he had stopped thinking about the future entirely for several years, and had just moved through the present like a man navigating fog. He told her about the war, not the battles. He could not do that, but the shape of it, what it had done to the 20-year-old version of himself that had gone in, and how different the person who came out had been from the person who went in, and how he was not sure sometimes that anyone who had not been there could fully understand what that was like, and how that had made him feel for years like he was on one side of a glass wall from everyone else in the world. She listened without flinching. She asked questions that were not about the blood or the tactics, but about the interior. What did it feel like? What did you want? What did you lose of yourself that you have not gotten back? No one had asked him those questions. He had not asked them of himself, not out loud. He found himself answering them, and she told him things too. About her mother, who had been a stern, capable woman who had shown love primarily through action rather than words, and how Dorothea had learned to speak both languages but was never quite sure which one she was hearing. About her husband who had left. His name had been Martin, which she said with a flatness that communicated better than any elaboration could, and what it had been like to understand that the person she had made a life with had decided, essentially, that she was not worth staying for. About the child she had lost, a boy she had thought about naming James, and how she had put him away in a place that was not for visiting often, but that she did not pretend was not there. The trust between them built the way the best things build, not in a single dramatic moment but in many small ones, until one day you look at what you have made together and understand that it is strong enough to hold weight. In February, on a Sunday afternoon when the canyon was ice bright and the apple trees were stark, bare silhouettes against the red rock, Kieran came to Sunday dinner and found Dorothea standing at the kitchen window with her hand pressed flat against the glass, looking at the orchard, and when he came inside and she turned around, her eyes were wet. He crossed to her without speaking and put his arms around her, which was the first time he had done that. Held her fully, not just her hands or her face but all of her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and stood there for a moment with her hands against his chest, and he held her carefully, the way he had kissed her in the orchard, like something irreplaceable. "James would have been 4 this month," she said against his coat. "I know," he said. He did not know the date specifically, but he had remembered it was February. They stood like that for a while, and then she lifted her head and looked at him, and her face was steady again, the way it always became, not because the feeling went away, but because she had long practice at carrying it upright. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not saying anything," she said. "You did not need me to say anything." "No," she said. "I needed you to be here, and you are." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Dorothea, I want to ask you something." She waited. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not today. I am not asking today. I want you to understand that. I am telling you that I want to ask, so that you can think about it without being caught by surprise, because I know you dislike being surprised by things that matter, and this matters." She looked at him with an expression he had not quite seen before, something that was both amused and moved simultaneously, which seemed like an almost impossible combination but which she managed. "You are announcing your intention to eventually ask me to marry you," she said. "Yes." "So that I have time to prepare my answer. So that it is not a decision made in a single moment," he said. "Because I want whatever answer you give me to be one that has had time to be certain." A long pause. The canyon light came through the kitchen window and lay across the floor in bars of pale February gold. "Kieran Jace," she said, "do you know that you are almost entirely unlike any other person I have ever met?" "Is that good?" he said. "It is extraordinary," she said. She kissed him then, standing in her kitchen in February with the apple trees bare outside the window, and it was a different kind of kiss than the one in the orchard. That one had been a beginning, and this one was something further along, something that knew itself better, and he understood that she was giving him her answer in advance, because she had clearly already thought about it and she did not need more time. He asked her formally, 3 weeks later, on a Sunday in early March, with the first green appearing at the tips of the apple branches and the canyon starting to smell like something coming back to life. He had a ring, not the tin brooch, something real, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it that he had purchased from a jeweler in Carson City on his second trip there, this one voluntary, and that he had been carrying in the same pocket as the brooch for 3 weeks. He asked her on the porch in the afternoon, in the direct, straightforward way of everything he did, She said yes. She said it immediately, without ceremony, with the same directness. And then she put her arms around his neck and her face against his jaw, and said it again, quietly. And he held her in the March light with his hand in her hair, and felt something settle into place in his chest that he had been keeping ready for a long time without knowing what it was waiting for. They were married in May. Dorothea wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored wool, simply cut, with a small garnet brooch at the collar that was the tin brooch he had brought her from Carson City. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He said, "I do," with more conviction than he had ever said anything in his life. She said, "I do," looking directly at him, with her chin up and her eyes clear, in the voice of someone who had thought about this and arrived at it from the inside, not from obligation or circumstance, but from the specific and particular choosing of him, Kieran Jace, to be her person. They made their home at her farm. There was a conversation about this, whether she would come into town, whether he would give up his position and farm full-time, what the practical arrangements of their lives were going to look like. And they had it like they had most important conversations, plainly, at the kitchen table with coffee. They decided that he would keep his deputy position, which paid a wage they needed, and which was, as Dorothea said without sentiment, clearly one of the things he was built for. He would ride into Dustfall in the mornings and return in the evenings, except when the job required otherwise, which was not often. The farm was his home, and he took that seriously. He fixed things, built things, learned to tend the orchard under her guidance, which was patient and specific and occasionally amused by his mistakes in the way that expertise is always somewhat amused by beginners. He learned the garden the way he had learned the town, not by being told, but by watching long enough that the patterns emerged. He learned which beds she loved most, and which ones she tended with the grim determination of someone finishing an obligation. And he quietly took over some of the obligation ones so she could spend more time in the beds she actually liked. She noticed this after about 2 weeks and looked at him with an expression that he had come to recognize as a specific variety of love, the kind that comes not from grand gesture but from being paid close attention to. Summer came and the tomatoes came back, heavy and red on their vines, and the apple trees that he had ridden 5 days through the desert to protect bore their first real fruit. Small, slightly tart, imperfect in the way that first things are imperfect, and completely delicious. They ate the apples on the porch in the August evenings, and talked and rayed and sat in their particular comfortable silence, and Kieran thought, repeatedly, with the slightly stunned quality of someone who has received more than they expected, that this was what it was supposed to feel like. This ordinary, specific, daily thing. This was it. In November, Dorothea told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning, in the kitchen, before he left for his ride into town, and he stood very still for a moment, and then he sat down at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands, not from distress, but from the specific weight of joy, the kind that needs a moment to be absorbed before you can act normal again. She put her hand on the back of his neck. "Are you all right?" she said with a quietness that was only partly teasing. "Yes," he managed. "Yes, I am, yes." "You are not frightened," he raised his head. "I am terrified," he said honestly, "but the good kind. The kind that means something matters this much." She kissed the top of his head and then his temple and then his cheek with a tenderness that he felt in every part of himself. "Good," she said, "because I am terrified too, and I would not want to be the only one." He was late to work that morning. He did not particularly care. The winter of their first year was different from the winter before, fuller, with a different quality of warmth to it, the warmth of a house that knows it is a home rather than just a structure. Kieran kept close, took on no unnecessary patrols, was in Dustfall only as long as his duties required and home as quickly as could be managed. And Dorothea did not ask this of him, and he did not announce it. He simply did it, and she simply received it, and neither of them made more of it than was necessary because between them it was understood. He built a cradle in January, working at it in the evenings while Dorothea read by the lamp. He was not a skilled woodworker by any measure. He was a man who could fix things more than make them. But he worked at it with the patience he had learned from her garden, and what emerged was solid and smooth and made with intention. And she ran her hand along the edge of it and said, "It is beautiful," in the tone she used when she meant something completely. Their son was born in late March, when the canyon was just beginning to turn green at the edges, and Kieran held him in the first hour after his birth with the terrified carefulness of a man handling something perfect and fragile. And Dorothea watched him from the bed with her hair loose and her face exhausted and luminous, and she said, "His name is James." Kieran looked at her. "If that is all right with you," she said. "It is more than all right," he said. James Robert Jace was loud from the first day, which turned out to be one of his defining characteristics. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, and an opinion about everything that he developed the ability to communicate well, before he developed the vocabulary for it. He slept badly for the first 3 months, which meant Kieran and Dorothea slept badly for the first 3 months. And they navigated this with the particular combination of exhausted humor and deep partnership that the challenge of a new baby produces in people who are fundamentally on the same side. The canyon farmers loved him, which he repaid by charming every one of them with complete shamelessness from approximately 4 months onward. Helen Parker called him a politician in miniature. Albert Parker taught him to clap before he could walk. Gus, the fiddle player, played for him whenever he was in the canyon, and James always listened with the intense, concentrated attention of someone hearing something important. Kieran returned to his full duties in April, which was later than strictly required, and no one said a word about it. Sheriff Crane had 2 grown sons of his own, and understood without being told. Life in Dustfall and the canyon settled into a rhythm that was nothing like the one Kieran had kept before Dorothea. It had the same externals, the same ride into town, the same work, the same desert sky, but the interior of it was completely different. He had a reason to come home that was specific and real and waited for him. He had a voice he wanted to hear at the end of the day. He had a face that, when it turned toward him, made him understand in a cellular way that the worst of his life, the losses, the loneliness, the years of fog had not been the whole story. They had been the part of the story that had to happen to make him ready for this part. He thought about that sometimes on the ride home, the dust of the trail behind him and the canyon ahead, and the evening light doing its amber extravagance across the red rock. He thought about the letter, about the specific accident or not accident of finding it in a Bible brought in for a property dispute. He thought about the night he had read it in the empty jailhouse and whispered into the dark, and how that whisper had been heard by exactly no one and had still, somehow, changed everything. He thought about what she had written. "I wonder sometimes if there is anyone on this earth who is waiting for someone exactly like me without knowing it yet." And he thought about how precisely correct that question had been. He had been waiting. He had not known what he was waiting for, had not even known he was waiting. But the moment he had read those words, he had understood in the deepest available part of himself that she had described him accurately. He was exactly the person who had been waiting for someone exactly like her. 2 years after James was born, Dorothea told him she was expecting again. And this time there was less terror and more of the simple, profound gratitude that comes when you have been given something wonderful once and find that life intends to give you more. This time the pregnancy was easier. She was stronger, or the child was, or both. Their daughter was born in the summer, on a day when the canyon was full of heat and the apple trees were thick with fruit. And she was quiet where James had been loud, watchful where James had been immediately social. And she studied everything around her from her first week with the careful, considering look of someone filing away information for future use. Dorothea named her Clara. James was 4 when Clara was born, and took his role as older brother with a seriousness that would have been endearing if it had not occasionally manifested as him trying to reorganize Clara's blankets for her, while she was still in them. Clara responded to this by grabbing his finger and holding on. This turned out to be their dynamic going forward. Life was full. It was full in the way that Kieran had not believed life could be again. Not by conscious pessimism, but because fullness requires things that he had lost and had not thought would come back. It was full of noise, particularly James's, and of the good smell of bread baking and coffee brewing and the orchard in summer, and of evenings on the porch when both children were finally asleep, and he and Dorothea sat in the way they had always sat, side by side, comfortable in their silence or in their talking, not performing peace, but simply in possession of it. He had learned to tend the garden properly by then. Not just the obligation beds, but all of it, and he had added 2 new beds of his own in the second spring, one for beans, because they were practical, and one for sunflowers, because Dorothea had mentioned once that she found them unreasonably cheerful, and he had noted this and acted on it the following April. The sunflowers grew taller than his shoulder by August. She cut them for the house and put them in a blue pitcher on the kitchen table, and the kitchen was golden all September. When James was 6 and Clara was 2, Albert Parker came by to say that old Crowell, the man who had originally sold Dorothea the farm, had died out in California, and that his family had written to say that among his papers was a properly notarized copy of his purchase from Aaron Pierce, which finally closed the last gap in the chain of title completely and permanently. Albert said this with the satisfaction of a man closing a long open account. Kieran sat at the kitchen table that evening after the children were in bed and told Dorothea, and she listened, and then she said, "The farm is fully ours." "It always was," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said, "but now it is also on paper." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and laced her fingers through his, and they sat like that in the lamp-lit kitchen with the orchard dark beyond the window, and there was nothing left unresolved between them, nothing uncertain, nothing at risk of being taken. Just this, the farm and the children and the specific weight of each other's hands, the accumulated ordinary days of a life built piece by piece from the wreckage of other things. "I want to ask you something," Dorothea said. "All right," he said. "Are you happy?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved because she had asked it in the way she asked the questions that required thought, and she would know if he gave it a shortcut answer. "Yes," he said. He turned her hand over and traced the back of it with his thumb, the way he had started doing years ago and that she had never asked him to stop. "In the particular way that I understand happiness, which has always been quieter than I think it is supposed to be. Not a thing that shouts. A thing that is simply present." She was quiet for a moment, looking at their hands. Then she said, "That is exactly how it is." "Yes," he said. "I wrote in that letter that I wanted someone to know I existed," she said. "That I had thoughts and feelings that were specific to me and that mattered, that the particular way I was in the world was worth something. I was not asking for much, I think, just for someone to know." "I know," he said. "You know," she agreed. "You know all of it. she looked up at him. "I am glad it was you who found that letter, Kieran. I am glad it fell out of that Bible in that jailhouse and found you specifically." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the oil lamp's light. This woman who had stopped in a desert town on her way to somewhere else, and planted an orchard, and written her loneliness into the pages of a Bible, who had been found by it and found him through it, who had chosen him with the same deliberate care she applied to everything she loved, who had made a home with him that was more than either of them could have built alone. He thought of the jailhouse at midnight, the guttering lamp, the letter falling from his hands. He thought of the voice that had come from him without permission, into the empty room, into the dark. "I have been waiting for someone like you." "So am I," he said. The next morning, James woke them both before sunrise by standing at their bedroom door and announcing at full volume that he could hear the roosters, and therefore it was time. Kieran pulled the quilt over his head. Dorothea laughed and got up, and James took her hand and pulled her toward the kitchen, narrating his intentions for the day with the energy of someone who had been storing it up all night, which he probably had. Kieran lay in the quiet bedroom for a moment, listening to the sound of his family moving through the house, the small specific sounds of morning, the clatter of a cup, Clara beginning to stir in her room, and the soft high sound she made before she fully woke. Dorothea's voice saying something to James in a tone that was gently but firmly redirecting whatever he was about to do to the bread. He lay there and listened, and felt the particular richness of the ordinary filling the house like light fills a room when you open the shutters. Every corner. Then he got up. He had work to do and a family to have breakfast with and a garden to check on, and an orchard that was going to need attention before the frost, and a wife who would have opinions about all of it that were worth hearing, and 2 children who were going to make him laugh and exhaust him and surprise him every day for as long as he was given. He was not lonely. He was profoundly, specifically, exactly not lonely. He pulled on his boots and went to find his family.